took a job as a fire lookout the summer after I graduated college, and I genuinely thought it was going to be the best 3 months of my life. For anyone who doesn't know what that is, a fire lookout is basically a person who sits in a little tower on top of a mountain and watches the forest for smoke. When you spot a column of smoke rising up, you radio it in with the coordinates so the Forest Service can get on top of it before it turns into something serious. It sounds tedious to most people, but to me it sounded like paradise. I was 22. I was completely burnt out on people, and the idea of spending an entire summer alone in the wilderness was about the most appealing thing I could imagine. My parents thought I was insane. My boyfriend at the time thought I was making a huge mistake. I didn't care. I'd always been the type of person who needed a lot of alone time, and this was the ultimate version of that. The tower I got assigned to was in a national forest out west, and it was remote, like genuinely remote. The nearest town was over an hour away by car, and that's just to reach the trailhead. From the trailhead, it was another 4 miles uphill on foot to actually get to the tower. The Forest Service flew my supplies in by helicopter at the start of the season, so I had everything I needed: canned food, water, propane, a radio, the works. The tower itself was this little 14 by 14 cabin perched on top of a 30-foot steel frame. You climbed a set of stairs to get up to it, and from up there you could see for miles in every direction. Nothing but trees and ridgelines as far as the eye could see. The first time I climbed up and looked out, I almost cried. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The first few weeks were everything I'd hoped for. My days had a simple rhythm. I'd wake up with the sun, make coffee on my little propane stove, and do my rounds scanning the horizon with my binoculars. I'd radio in my morning check-in, read, write in my journal, and just exist. At night, the stars were unreal. No light pollution for 100 miles. I'd never felt so at peace in my life. I genuinely started to think I might do this every single summer. The first weird thing happened about a month in. I came down the tower stairs one morning to use the outhouse, which sat about 40 feet away at the edge of the clearing, and I noticed the ground near the bottom of the stairs looked disturbed. There was a patch of dirt that had been scuffed up, and what looked like a partial boot print pressed into the soft earth. I stood there staring at it for a while. My first thought was that maybe a hiker had wandered up. The trail to my tower wasn't a popular one, but it wasn't impossible for someone to find it. Lookouts get the occasional visitor. I figured someone had hiked up while I was asleep, seen the tower, and turned around without bothering me. A little strange that they'd come right up to the stairs, but not alarming. I didn't think much of it. A few days later, it happened again, except this time there were more prints, and they weren't just at the base of the stairs. They circled the whole tower. Someone had walked a complete loop around the steel frame, all the way around, in the night. I remember following the tracks with my eyes and feeling the first real prickle of unease. Why would a hiker walk a circle around my tower in the dark and then leave? It didn't make sense. I told myself maybe it was an animal, but the prints were clearly boots. I radioed it in during my morning check-in, kind of casually, just mentioning that it looked like someone had been around my tower at night. The guy on the other end said it was probably just a curious hiker and not to worry about it. He told me lookouts get visitors all the time. That made me feel a little better, but it kept happening. Every few mornings there'd be fresh tracks, and then I started finding other things. One morning my water jugs, which I kept stored under the tower, had been moved. Not taken, just moved, lined up in a different spot. Another morning, the door to my outhouse, which I always latched, was hanging wide open. I started latching everything obsessively and checking it twice before bed. The worst part was that I never heard anything. I'm a light sleeper, and whoever was doing this was completely silent. I'd lie awake at night straining to hear footsteps on the stairs, but there was never anything, just the wind. About 6 weeks in, I saw him for the first time. I was doing my evening scan with my binoculars, sweeping the tree line like I always did, and as I panned across the edge of the clearing, I caught movement. I pulled the binoculars back and refocused, and there, standing right at the edge of the trees maybe 200 feet away, was a man. He was just standing there, perfectly still, staring directly at the tower. He was wearing dark clothing and what looked like a hat pulled low. I couldn't make out his face. I froze with the binoculars pressed to my eyes, and I swear we just looked at each other for a full 30 seconds. Even though he couldn't have known I could see him that clearly. Then he stepped back into the trees and was gone. I radioed it in immediately, and this time I wasn't casual about it. I told them there was a man watching my tower, and that someone had been coming around at night for weeks. The dispatcher's tone changed. He asked me a bunch of questions and told me to lock myself in the cabin and keep the radio close. He said they'd send a ranger up first thing in the morning to check it out. That was the longest night of my life. I locked the cabin door, pushed a storage trunk in front of it, and sat in the corner with my back to the wall, clutching a kitchen knife and the radio. I left the lights off and just listened. Sometime in the dead of night, I heard the stairs creak. Then again, slow, deliberate steps coming up the tower toward my door. I stopped breathing. I could hear him reach the top of the stairs and stop right outside the door, just a few feet from where I was sitting. I heard the doorknob turn slowly, testing it. The trunk held. Then there was a long silence, and then I heard a single soft scratch against the door, like a fingernail being dragged down the wood. I have never been so terrified in my life. I keyed the radio and whispered that he was at my door, and the dispatcher told me to make as much noise as I possibly could. So I started screaming and banging on the wall and the floor with everything I had. After a moment, I heard the stairs creak again, faster this time, and then nothing. The ranger arrived at first light. By then, I was a complete wreck. They searched the area and found a campsite about a quarter mile down the slope, tucked into a thick stand of trees with a clear line of sight to my tower. Whoever had been there was gone, but they'd been living there for a while. The ranger said there were signs someone had been watching the tower for weeks, maybe the entire season. They never figured out who it was. I left that day, and I never went back. To this day, I can't be alone in the woods without thinking about that scratch on the door. My family has owned a piece of hunting land in the rural part of our state for as long as I've been alive. It's about 80 acres of thick woods with a couple of clearings and a creek running through it, and my grandfather bought it back in the 70s for almost nothing. We've hunted deer on it for 3 generations now. When my grandfather passed, the land went to my dad, and these days my dad's getting older, so the responsibility of maintaining it has mostly fallen to me. I'm the one who goes out to check the property, clear the trails, and set up for hunting season every fall. I've spent more time in those woods than just about anyone alive, and I know every inch of them, or at least I thought I did. A few years ago, I got into using trail cameras to scout for deer. If you're not familiar, a trail camera is a little weatherproof camera you strap to a tree. It has a motion sensor, so whenever something walks in front of it, it snaps a photo. Hunters use them to figure out what deer are moving through an area and when, so you know where to set up. I bought a few of them and placed them around the property at the spots where I knew deer liked to travel. The way mine worked, I'd have to physically go out to each camera every couple weeks and pull the SD card to see what it had captured. It was always kind of exciting, like opening a present. You never knew what you were going to get. The first couple of months were normal. Lots of deer, a few turkeys, the occasional raccoon or coyote, standard stuff. Then one day I pulled the card from the camera I had set up near the creek on the far end of the property, and there was a photo that stopped me cold. It was taken at 3:47 in the morning, and at the very edge of the frame, partially cut off, there was a person. You could only see part of them, an arm and a shoulder and part of a leg, like they'd walked just past the edge of the camera's range. They appeared to be wearing regular clothes. I stared at it for a long time. My first thought was a trespasser, which made me angry more than anything. People sometimes wander onto private land to hunt or hike, and it's a problem. But our property is posted with no trespassing signs everywhere, and it's pretty deep in. Most people don't end up out there by accident. Still, I figured it was probably just some guy who got turned around. I didn't think much of it. When I pulled the same card 2 weeks later, there were more photos, and this is where it started to really get to me. There were 3 separate photos of the same person, all taken between 2 and 4 in the morning on different nights, and in each one he was a little closer to the camera. In the first one, he was off to the side again. In the second, he was more centered, maybe 15 feet away, and you could see he was a man, though his face was turned away. In the third, he was standing maybe 10 feet from the camera, facing it, but his head was tilted down so you still couldn't see his face clearly. There was just something deeply wrong about the way he was standing. Too still, his arms hanging straight down at his sides. I remember getting a chill looking at it. What kind of person walks around the deep woods at 3 in the morning and stops to stand in front of a camera? I told my dad about it, and he said it was probably some homeless guy or a drug user camping out there, which does happen in rural areas more than people think. He told me to put up more cameras and keep an eye on it, and that if it kept up, we'd call the sheriff. So that's what I did. I added 2 more cameras to that section of the property, and I waited. The next batch of photos is something I'll never forget. The man showed up on all 3 cameras in that area now, on multiple nights, always in those same early morning hours, and he was getting closer to all of them. But there was one photo in particular. It was from the camera nearest the creek, and it was a close-up of his face. He had walked right up to the camera, close enough that his face filled most of the frame, and he was looking directly into the lens. His expression was completely blank, not angry, not curious, just empty. His eyes were these dark hollows in the camera's flash. His hair was long and matted, and his face was filthy, streaked with dirt, and he had a beard that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But the thing that really disturbed me was that he was smiling. just slightly, like he knew exactly what the camera was and he wanted me to see him. That was enough for me. I called the sheriff's office and they sent a deputy out. But of course, by the time anyone came, there was no one around. They took my information and the photos and said they'd keep an eye out, but they were pretty clear that there wasn't much they could do about someone just walking through the woods, even on private land, unless we caught them in the act. I wasn't satisfied with that. This was my family's land, and the thought of this guy living out there, watching, was eating at me. So I made the decision to go out there myself during the day and see if I could find where he was staying. In hindsight, that was a stupid thing to do alone. But I brought my rifle, and I figured I knew the land better than anyone. I followed the creek down toward where the cameras were, scanning the woods as I went. It was eerily quiet out there, even by the standards of those woods. After about 45 minutes of searching, I found it. Tucked back in a thick grove of pines, in a spot I'd somehow never paid attention to in all my years out there, was a crude little camp. It wasn't a tent, more like a lean-to made of branches and a torn blue tarp with a fire pit in front of it. There was trash everywhere, cans and wrappers and bottles, and a filthy sleeping bag inside. But the thing that made my stomach drop was what was nailed to the trees around the camp. There were photos, printed photos, and as I got closer, I realized they were trail camera photos. My trail camera photos. Of deer, of the property, and several of them were of me, checking the cameras, that I had no memory of him ever being there for. He'd been pulling my cards, printing the photos and putting them back. He'd been watching me the entire time. I did not stick around. I backed out of there as fast as I could and called the sheriff again from the road. And this time they took it more seriously. They searched the camp and confirmed someone had been living out there for a long time, but the man himself was never found. We pulled all the cameras and I haven't put a single one back up since. We still own the land, but I won't go out there alone anymore, and honestly, I haven't hunted it since. Every time I think about all those nights I was out there by myself, completely unaware that someone was standing just out of frame watching me, I feel sick. Two years ago, I did something that a lot of people told me was reckless, and looking back, they were completely right. I bought a piece of remote land site unseen at an online auction. I'd been wanting to get out of the city for a while, and the dream was to eventually build a small off-grid cabin somewhere I could disappear on the weekends. The parcel was 40 acres of forested land in a mountainous part of the state, and I got it for a price that, in retrospect, should have been a giant red flag. It was cheap because it was landlocked and difficult to access, with no real road, just an old logging trail that had mostly been reclaimed by the forest. But to me, that was a feature, not a bug. The whole point was to be isolated. I closed on it, and a few weeks later I loaded up my truck with camping gear and drove out to see my new property for the first time. The drive-in was an adventure by itself. The last several miles were on that old logging trail, and I had to get out twice to move fallen branches before my truck could pass. By the time I reached the edge of my parcel, I felt like I was in the middle of nowhere, which was exactly what I wanted. I parked, grabbed my pack, and started hiking in to explore. The land was beautiful, thick old forest with a lot of elevation, and I spent the first couple hours just wandering and taking it all in, imagining where I'd put my cabin. I was completely euphoric. This was mine. It was while I was exploring the back portion of the property that I found the first sign that I wasn't alone. I came across a path, not a deer trail, an actual worn footpath, the kind that only forms when people walk the same route over and over for a long time. That stopped me. My land was supposed to be empty, and the nearest neighbor, as far as I knew, was miles away. I followed the path for a little while out of curiosity, and that's when I started seeing other things. A rusted out can hanging from a string in a tree, a pile of old bottles, what looked like the remains of a small fire, fairly recent. My first thought was that maybe hunters used the land, since it had sat vacant for who knows how long before I bought it. That seemed reasonable. People do hunt and camp on unattended land all the time. I told myself that's all it was, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't put a knot in my stomach. I should have left right then. Instead, I kept following the path because I wanted to understand what I was looking at. It wound deeper into the property, into a section that was so densely wooded the canopy almost blocked out the sky, and eventually it opened up into a small clearing. And in that clearing was a camp. Not a campsite, a camp. There were two ramshackle structures built out of scrap wood and tarps and pieces of corrugated metal, the kind of thing that takes a long time to build. There was a fire pit with a grate over it, cooking pots, jugs of water, clothing hanging on a line strung between two trees. People were living here, multiple people by the looks of it, and it was clearly not abandoned. The fire pit was still smoking faintly. I stood at the edge of that clearing, absolutely frozen, and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave. This was my land, legally, but in that moment, that fact felt completely meaningless. I was alone, miles from anyone, and I had stumbled into the home of people who very clearly did not want to be found. I started backing away slowly, trying not to make a sound, and that's when I heard a voice behind me say, "You lost?" I spun around and there was a man standing maybe 20 feet away on the path I'd just come down. He'd come up behind me completely silently. He was tall and gaunt, with a long, unkempt beard, wearing filthy layered clothing, and he was holding a hatchet down at his side. He wasn't raising it or anything, just holding it, but the message was clear. I tried to stay calm. I told him I was the new owner of the property and that I hadn't realized anyone was out here. I figured being upfront and non-threatening was my best bet. His expression didn't change at all. He just stared at me and said, "There's no owner out here." Then he took a step toward me. I have never felt fear like I felt in that moment. I turned and started moving back toward my truck as fast as I could without outright running, because some part of my brain told me that running would trigger something. But I could hear him following me, keeping pace, staying just behind me. And then I heard other movement in the woods on either side of me, branches and brush, and I realized there were others. They were pacing me through the trees, flanking me on both sides. I couldn't see them clearly, just shapes moving through the undergrowth. But they were there. They were hurting me. At that point, I gave up on staying calm and I just ran. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the forest back toward where I'd left my truck. I could hear them behind me and beside me the whole way, and the worst part was that they weren't yelling or making any noise. They were just silently keeping up. I lost the path at one point and had to navigate by memory, praying I was going the right direction. When I finally burst out of the trees and saw my truck, I was so relieved I almost cried. I ripped the door open, jumped in, locked it, and fumbled to get the keys in the ignition with my hands shaking so badly I could barely do it. As the engine turned over, I looked up and saw 3 of them emerge from the tree line at the edge of the property, just standing there at the spot where I'd come out, watching me. None of them came any closer, they just watched. I threw the truck in reverse and got out of there, branches scraping the sides the whole way down that logging trail. I drove straight to the county sheriff's office and reported everything. They told me that squatters living on remote, unattended land is unfortunately a real problem in that part of the state, and that some of these encampments have been there for years. They said removing people like that is a long legal process, and that they couldn't just go in and clear them out, especially since I didn't have any structures or improvements on the land to show I was actively using it. They advised me, somewhat grimly, not to go back out there alone. I never did get those people off my land. I ended up just selling the parcel a few months later, at a loss, to a logging company that I figured would have the resources to deal with whatever was out there. I don't know what happened to those people, and I don't want to know. What I do know is that there are places in this country, not even that far from civilization, where the normal rules just don't apply, and where there are people living out in the deep woods who will do anything to keep it that way. I count myself lucky that I made it back to my truck.